Another key part of avocados is pollination. And that's going to be a big concern up here in the valley. And our next speaker is Dr. Inaki Hormaza. Inaki hails from Malaga, Spain. Originally, he's from Basque Country. His research career has done many things, but one of the things he's really spent a lot of time on is avocado flowering.
Okay, thank you, Marilu, and thank you all for being here today. Yes, so I'm going to talk about avocado pollination. So I'm going to tell you overview of the system and the problems that we are facing with pollination in this crop. As Marilu was saying, I come from Spain, from the southern part of Spain, where we can grow avocados. Is the only place basically in continental Europe where you can really grow avocados because we have a very special microclimate, basically free of temperatures below freezing. Of course, we have problems with the lack of water, similar to here in California, but the climate is pretty much similar to the climate in the coastal areas of southern California. This is an image of our landscape there. We've changed the landscape from a very rain-fed crop of almonds and olive to now a very rich ecosystem of subtropical fruit crops and irrigation. Not only avocados, but also chirimoyas, mangoes, lychees, papayas, starfruit, longan, coffee. I mean, you can grow many different subtropical crops in that part of Spain. But going back to avocados, as you know, there's almost a single variety worldwide, which is Hass, which was developed here in California more than 100 years ago. And we can grow Hass avocados in more than 50 countries worldwide with different environments. There are some images here from the hills in Chile to the tropical climate in Colombia, subtropical climate in highlands in Mexico, the coastal desert of Peru, or the Mediterranean in Spain or Italy. So we grow Hass in a very different environmental conditions. And that has some implication also when we talk about results in some situations. They are not always extrapolable. They are not always we can use the same data in different climates. So we have to study in each situation how the Hass tree is going to behave. And of course, there is life beyond Hass. So this is just an image of some of the cultivars in our collection back in Spain with more than 100 different varieties. But most of the research on avocado pollination has been made on Hass. Okay, so this is a Hass avocado tree at full bloom. And if you count the flowers here, you can have millions of flowers in this single avocado tree. And this is a close-up image of the inflorescence, and you can have hundreds of flowers in the same inflorescence. And sometimes you get the situation where you're very happy with many fruitless in the inflorescence after flowering, but at the end, this is what happens. So from all those hundreds of flowers of fruitless, then you get 1, 2, 3, 4 fruits in the inflorescence. If you're happy, or if you're lucky, sometimes you can have something like this, but it's not so common. So what is going on here? So why is the avocado producing so many flowers and so few fruits? So that's something that we've been trying to answer in my research group for over 20 years now. So what we see in the avocado is there is a massive drop of flowers and fruitlets. And we would check those fruitlets. Most of them are unpollinated. So they are initial development, and then they drop because they are not fertilized. But even when you do hand pollination, and you can see that in this graph here, with hand pollination, we can increase yield from natural yield, which is about 0.15%. That means natural yield is between 1 or 2 fruits per 1,000 flowers. If we apply pollen by hand on the stigma of the flowers, you can increase that. In this case, up to 2.8%. That's a lot of increase, but still, you're applying pollen, and 97% of the flowers are dropping, even if you apply pollen. So there are two things going on here. One is lack of pollination, because you can increase yield when you apply pollen by hand. But the other thing is something intrinsic to the flower, that the flower is going to drop regardless if pollen arrives or not. So we have those two problems. And we're going to just cover very briefly the avocado flowering cycle, which is very interesting and is very unique. So the flowers are hermaphrodite, so they have both the male and female organs, but they mature at different times. This is an image of a female flower. You can see here the anthers which are closed. So the pollen is inside, but it's not ready to be released. This is the pistil, the female part, with the stigma here white, waiting for the pollen grains. This flower will open for, depending on the temperature, 3, 4, 5 hours, and then it will close. And then the next day, it will open again. And then it will open as a male flower. These are the anthers starting to open, so the pollen is going to be released. And this, the female part of the flower is here, and you see that the stigma is now brown. This stigma is not ready to receive pollen anymore. So even if the pollen grains now go to that stigma in the male flower, usually you get no fertilization, no fruit set. Okay, so this flower will be open as in the male stage for a few hours also, and then it will close, and that's the end of the flower. So each flower has a cycle of about 2 days. Of course, you have flowers for months, depending on the temperature, but every single flower is going to be open only for 2 days. In some cases, when temperatures are good, you can have this situation, and when you can have closing female flowers and opening male flowers in the same inflorescence. So that you have bees, the bees can transfer the pollen from the male flowers to the female flowers in the same inflorescence, in the same tree, or in the same orchard if you have the same variety. Okay, so this is the situation. Female flowers, the male flower the next day, and then some overlap for some hours. And if you see this in a scheme like this is what happens. Above is the female stage and below the male stage. I'm going to show you this in a video with high velocity, and you'll see how the system works. So first you see 2 flowers opening in the female stage, the first day of the cycle of the flower. They will be open for 3-4 hours. This is very fast. They will close, and now the system will go overnight, and the next day you'll see some flowers opening here as females, and remember that these ones were the ones that opened yesterday as male flowers, as female flowers. So you have the new flowers open as female, and the ones that opened yesterday, now they open and in the male stage. And there's a time of overlap between both stages. Okay, so this is the system in the avocado flowers. And we have 2 different kinds of avocado genotypes depending on how the system works. And they are so-called A and B type. You know that Hass is an A type cultivar, and for example, Fuerte and other pollinizer trees for Hass, like Ettinger, Surprise, Sultano, or Luna, are B type. The difference is that in the A type cultivars like Hass, the flower opens as females in the morning, they close, and they open the next day in the afternoon as males. In the B-type cultivars like Fuerte or Luna, the flowers will open in the afternoon as females, they will close, and they will open the next morning or 2 days later in the morning as male flowers.
You have gem on there. Which one is gem?
Gem is A-type cultivar. This is the situation. The first day of the cycle, in the A-type cultivars, the flowers will open in the morning as females and in the afternoon as males of the next day, and the contrary in the B-type cultivars. So the pollen goes from the A-type cultivar, B-type cultivars to the A-type cultivars in the morning, and from the A-type cultivars to the B-type cultivars in the afternoon. So this is the flowering behavior of avocados. Recently, there are a couple of papers at least that they are finding the genes involved in this, and probably we can do some improvement in the future knowing the genes involved in determining A and B type cultivars. So then the pollen will arrive to the stigma, and the pollen in the stigma has to germinate, so the stigma has to be receptive. So that's why that happens during the female stage. The pollen hydrates in the stigma, germinates, and produces pollen tubes. The pollen tubes have to grow through the style to reach the ovule, and finally produce fertilization of the ovule. And if everything goes right, then you will have a fruit. You have a seed from the embryo, and then you have the pericarp with the endocarp, mesocarp, and exocarp, and the mesocarp is the flesh of the fruit, which is derived from the ovary of the flower. So there are basically 4 topics that are limiting avocado production during the flowering period, and I'm going to cover briefly the four different topics. The first one is environmental factors, and been listening before to climate change, so we know that climate change was coming. Now climate change, of course, is here, and we've seen this in different. Can see that in global temperature change in the last 20 years. You see that temperatures globally are higher. Also in California is an example in Los Angeles. But more interesting is when you look at when those changes are taking place during the year. And we see that the increase in temperature is taking place in the winter at the global level, in the spring, in the summer, in the autumn. So we are seeing increase in temperatures all year round. And this is very important, especially for flowering. And this is just an example in Spain of what's going on with this increase in temperatures in the winter time. So we're having milder winters, higher temperatures, and we are seeing an advance in the flowering period in avocado. This is us in Malaga, Spain, and in the last 20 years, we've seen an advance in flowering period for 1 month. So Hass avocados are flowering 1 month earlier than 2 years ago. Why is that important? It's important because very often the temperatures in March, in this case, are normal for March. And normal for March mean too cold for avocados in Spain. So we get earlier blooming, low temperatures, flower drop, and no fruit set. I'm going to tell you why this is happening. Of course, it's difficult to work at the tree level with flowers because they are tiny flowers, the trees are very big. So usually we work in the laboratory. We collect the flowers from the trees, we go to the laboratory, and then we can apply different temperatures and different humidities to the flowers in that system over there. You can keep the flowers for about five days in that system. And we've been studying the microscope, the effect of different temperatures and different humidities. And basically, we see that there is no fertilization and fruit set when you pollinate in the male stage. I'm not going to go into detail, but when you pollinate the flowers in the male stage, usually there is no fertilization. The flowers don't produce fruit, so you have to pollinate in the female stage. We've been studying different temperatures. We've been studying different humidities. And at the end, what we have seen is that temperatures between 15 to 25 centigrades is optimal for avocado flowering and for pollen behavior. And humidities below 75% also are not good for flowering in avocado. That's for pollen germination on the stigma, but also for pollen tube growth in the style. Once the pollen germinates, it has to grow the pollen tube to the ovary. And we've seen that temperatures, for example, here above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, the pollen tubes grow so fast that by the time they reach the ovule is still not ready for the pollen tube. So there is no fertilization. Temperatures about 50 Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. The pollen tubes grow so slow that it takes more than 2 days to reach the ovule. And by the time the pollen tubes reach the ovules are not ready anymore. So the optimum temperature also for pollen tube growth, between 65 and 75, 80 Fahrenheit will be optimum for pollen tube growth in avocado.
What about the humidity?
Below 75%, you start to have problems with stigma receptivity and pollen tube germination and growth. So it's better above 75%, an average. Yeah, the question is that there are differences among where the inflorescences are placed in the canopy. Of course, if you have inflorescences which are outside, are more exposed to low humidities, you'll have more problems than inflorescences inside if you have higher humidities because you have the irrigation system, for example. There are also differences among varieties in the behavior, at least at different temperatures. This is an example, different temperatures of different varieties. And then you have some varieties that are able to produce pollen grains that behave better at low or at high temperatures. So there is a room there for improvement to improve varieties or select varieties more adapted to higher temperatures. That's something that hasn't been done yet, I think, but it's something that is of interest, especially to very dry or very hot areas at blooming time. You can select the best pollinator trees for your variety. And the other thing about avocado pollen is the avocado pollen has a very short viability. In this example here, in 24 hours at room temperature, the pollen doesn't germinate anymore. So you cannot conserve the pollen as you can do with walnuts or you can do with almonds to pollinate some days after the flowers are open. You can increase that when you lower the temperature. You can keep the flowers at 4 degrees and increase the length of viability. But usually, as I say, pollen in avocado has a very short life. And the consequences when you have also, you can have pollination, you can have fertilization, initial embryo development, but then you have a very high or very low temperatures, then you can have this situation. There's an embryo abortion. Usually is due mainly due to high temperatures, but it can also happen with very low temperatures. You have embryo abortion, and then you have these kind of fruits, which are the so-called cukes, that they don't grow very, very much, okay? Inhibit both pollination and fertilization. Relative humidity is below 75%, reduce stigmatic receptivity. There are differences among varieties in pollen germination at different temperatures. There is no fertilization when the pollen arrives to the flower in the male stage, and climate change is advancing flowering period with detrimental consequences for pollination and fertilization. The second topic I want to talk about is flower quality. When you look at the avocado flowers, they all look the same, but we've seen before that most of the flowers will drop even if you apply pollen. So maybe they are not the same when you look inside. So we did an experiment some years ago, and what we did was to collect flowers from the avocados and apply a stain for starch. Starch is one of the compounds the plants use as to reserve to have food for growth, okay? Carbohydrates. So when we look at the microscope, the different flowers of the avocado inflorescence, we see flowers like the ones in the left with very few starch content. The black points there are starch. And then you see some flowers like the one in the right with a very high starch content. When you plot that in a graph, you see that there are some few flowers with very large starch content in the flower and some flowers with low starch content. So the hypothesis here is, well, maybe the flowers with more starch content are more ready to develop a fruit, and those are the ones that are going to develop the fruit if pollinated. Of course, that's a bit difficult to prove, because when you do the analysis, you have to destroy the flower to see the starch content. So we developed a system in which we hand-pollinated the avocado flowers, in this case with the open anther. We wrap that on the stigma, so you pollinate the flower, and then you label each avocado flower. Like this, okay? It takes about 1 day for the pollen grain to reach the ovule. So by the time the flower opens the second day as male flower, the pollen tubes are already in the ovule. So what we did was, we did this, and the next day when the flower opened in the male stage, we removed the styles and we saved the styles, and we left the ovaries in the tree. We saw that this doesn't cause any problems. I mean, the fruit set is very low if you cut or if you don't cut the styles. You get this situation, you have all the flowers labeled and you have the styles of each single flower saved. And then you can know what was going to happen with the ovary in the tree. And finally, this is what we found: the flowers with more starch content and the ones that are more likely to produce fruits. The other ones, even if you pollinate them, they are not good flowers, they are low quality flowers, and they're going to drop. We did similar experiments with colleagues in New Zealand, and we looked at other things, not only starch. We looked at boron, we had the same results. We looked again at starch, but also we looked at different carbohydrates, and the situation is always the same. The flowers that are maintained in the tree and produce fruits are the ones with higher boron, higher starch, and higher carbohydrate content. So that means that they are flowers of different quality in the tree. So most avocado flowers have low flower quality, so they're going to drop, even if you pollinate them. And the second thing is that this has helped us to change the fertilization application in Spain. Growers, they didn't used to apply fertilization in the winter time because they assumed that the tree was resting at that time. We've seen that that's not the case, that the trees are still active in the spring, and that applying fertilization during the winter months is also improving the quality of the flowers of the following spring. Okay, the third topic is pollenizers. So we talk about A and B type avocados. So very often, you know that people plant Hass, and then they plant some pollinizers for Hass of B type. There are different works in different parts of the world about this topic. In some cases, it's been seen a clear effect of putting a pollinizer close to your Hass. Not in all the cases, but the common knowledge is that this is going to help increasing fruit set. Initial studies were done in Israel, and in Israel was very clear that you need to plant pollinizer trees. It's a drier climate and higher temperatures also than the ones we have in southern Spain or in coastal California. Examples in California also is a study in which Maria Paya was involved, also shown that you can see a difference, but especially the difference is when your tree is very close to your house. So the influence is lower when the trees are too far away from your house trees. So ideally, you should plant 50% of each, 50% of house and 50% of pollinator trees. But you know that the price of the fruit is not the same. So you have to make a balance on that. In some cases, like in southern Spain, coastal Peru, South Africa, you can even have solid blocks of hash with no pollinator, and the yields can be very good. So an example in Spain, for example, with bacon as pollinator, we didn't see any difference in yield, depending on the distance to the pollinizer tree, although we saw a difference in the paternity. Of course, when you are closer to the pollinizer, most of the fruits will be progeny of that pollinizer. And you can check that with molecular markers. But we didn't see any clear effect on fruit set. There is another example in one of our orchards in Spain, in which more than 50% of the fruits are hash by hash, even if the trees are placed in a plot with many pollinizers. And then you can have other fruits from bacon, sultano, fuerte, and others. But very often, most of your fruit in your orchard will be self-pollination of hash during that period of overlap between female and male flowers. And these are examples in Peru, in which you have very good productivity in orchards with only hash, but it's a very mild climate with very stable temperatures and very high humidity in the coastal part of Peru. And finally, the final point about pollination in avocado is pollinators. So this means the insects that are going to transfer the pollen from the anthers to the stigma. So the question here is if avocado production is limited by pollination. And of course, you need insects to bring the pollen to the stigma, either inside the tree during that overlap period or between trees of different floral groups. But this was already shown also by Maria Paya and collaborators some years ago, in which they saw that you need insects similar to the honeybee to have a good pollination avocado. When you remove the insects from your system, you get basically no fruit set. The thing here is that the origin of the avocado is Mexico, and in America there were no honeybees till the Europeans arrived. So the avocado evolved in presence of other different insects, which is not the honeybee. There are melipona bees, which are stingless bees of the Americas, or also some species of wasps native to the Americas. These are just some examples of some melipona beehives, local American bees. And this was already known in ancient times in the Americas. So the thing is that we are mostly using honeybees worldwide for avocado pollination, but the honeybee doesn't seem to be the best insect for avocado pollination. As I said, we have a problem with pollination because when you apply pollen to the flowers, you can increase fruit set. And what we did some years ago was just go out to the field, collect flowers, and see what's going on there, and see how many flowers were getting pollen naturally. And this is what we got. Don't worry about the different colors, because these are just the number of flowers in the inflorescence. The important thing here is that in this situation, in an orchard with honeybees present, about 80% of the flowers don't receive pollen. And when you look at the flowers that receive pollen, most of the flowers that receive pollen only receive between 1 to 5 pollen grains. Very few flowers receive more than 6 pollen grains. So we have a problem here. Flowers don't receive pollen, and the ones that receive pollen receive very few pollen grains. So what we did was to increase the number of beehives in this case. So we have two situations here. The first one is 10 beehives per hectare at one end of the orchard, and in that case, the orchard was about 2 acres, one hectare big. And in the second part, we installed 24 beehives per hectare, and in different parts of the orchard. So these are the results here. You can see in the first case, with 10 beehives per hectare, we are having pollen only in 17% of the flowers. So the rest of the flowers don't receive any pollen grain, so they're going to drop. But when you look when the flowers receive the pollen, you see that only 3% or 3.7% of the flowers receive pollen in the female stage. And as I told you before, that is the stage in which pollen has to arrive to the flower. Because if the pollen arrives in the male stage, that will produce no fruit set. So basically, in the first situation, with 10 beehives per hectare, we are getting only 3.7% of the flowers with pollen. In the second situation, with 24 beehives per hectare, which is a very large amount of beehives, we are getting pollen only on 12% of the flowers in the orchard. So the rest are going to drop. So this is an important situation because even if you increase the number of beehives, most of your flowers are not going to receive pollen in the female stage. We also studied the effect of the number of pollen grains on the likelihood of a flower to develop into a fruit. We did a similar system as the one I told you before for starch. And basically what we've seen is that, of course, when you have these are different colors mean flowers that drop very early, they are retained for a few weeks, and the ones in green is the ones that reach fruit maturity. When you have 0 pollen grains, of course, they will all drop. But also when you have between 1 to 5 pollen grains, most of the flowers will drop. You get, of course, very high fruit set when you have more than 40 pollen grains in the stigma, but this is impossible in nature. This was done by hand pollination. As I showed you before, most of the flowers will get, if they get pollen, they will get between 1 to 10 pollen grains. We did similar experiments in commercial orchards in Spain, and in all of them, we saw the same situation. Most of the flowers don't receive pollen grains, and the one that receive pollen grains receive very few pollen grains. Similar observation in Peru, same situation. This is in 2 different cases in the north and the south of Peru. Of course, when you apply, when you install beehives, you're going to increase the number of pollen of flowers with pollen, and you're going to increase productivity. In this case, in Peru, if you look at the right, in the female stage, orchard A will have more flowers with pollen than orchard B, and the yield is higher in orchard A than in orchard B. So it's a clear effect of having more flowers with pollen on having more fruits per tree. So you have to use honeybees or to produce fruits in avocado, but not only honeybees. There is a whole world out there of different insects that can pollinate avocados. In Europe, for example, we have more than 1,000 species of solitary bees. They don't make colonies, but they are solitary, but are useful in pollinating avocado and other crops. Have this kind of structures in which you can attract these kind of insects to pollinate your flowers. This is how they behave in the spring. So they are just bringing pollen from the avocado and from other flowers to their nets, so they can feed their larvae when they grow. So it's important to have additional sources of food for these kind of insects. Of course, you can construct bee hotels to attract them, but you have to feed them not only with avocado flowers, something more diverse. So this is what you do is covering plants to produce different flowers at different times of the year. So also the different bees are going to be happier that they are only exposed to avocado flowers. And this is just, I want to show you some images of different insects that visit the avocado flowers, at least in Spain. Of course, bees, wasps, bumblebees. In fact, in Israel, they are more and more using bumblebees for pollination of avocados, but also flies. Flies are very common in avocado orchards, and we've seen that flies can be pollinators of avocado, especially this kind of flies, the sylphides, the hoverflies, which they resemble like bees or wasps, but they are not, because if you look at the eyes are eyes of flies, and they are very interesting for avocado pollination. You can also see some other insects like butterflies, beetles, etc. We're doing some research mainly on flies in caged situations in avocado, and we've seen that the flies are able to carry pollen on their bodies. Those grains of pollen grains there are avocado pollen attached to the body of the fly, so they are useful for that. There are different reports in different parts of the world, like this is in Colombia, of different bees and different other insects that are interesting for avocado pollination. Some reports, for example, in Australia, in which wild pollinators are more effective, that they introduce honeybee. So I think this is very important to keep in mind, that we have to rely on diversity of insects, and those are going to help to improve pollination and finally improve fruit set. So if we go to the beginning, the question was, so what's going on with all these flowers of the avocado and why so few fruits at the end? If we take into account all these factors like environmental stress, temperature and humidity at flowering, flower quality, that most avocado flowers are of low quality, they are produced just to produce pollen, not to produce fruits. So that's a problem that we have. That in some cases we need pollinizer trees of complementary floral group for our variety, and also pollination deficit, that in many cases we have very few flowers that receive pollen from the insects. So we need to perform all these kind of studies in the different avocado producing regions to advance in improving avocado fruit set. And with that, I will finish my talk. Thank you so much. The question is, if you apply water irrigation on top of the tree to decrease the temperature, if that's going to affect the pollen. That it will affect the pollen only if the water falls on the pollen itself, because the pollen will explode. Okay. Usually that's not the case, because the pollen is in the anthers, or it could be in the stigma. With that system, you can decrease temperature in the canopy. You're going to improve stigmatic receptivity, and probably you're going to improve also the overlap between the male and female stages. So the only problem is when the water drop will fall on the pollen grains. So the ideal thing will be to do that during the hours in which you don't have the female flowers open, which is usually is between, depending on the temperature and the place, but between 11 to 3 p.m. The question is, if there are some plant growth regulators that can help to increase the yield after doing flowering. If you have some deficit, for example, in boron or calcium or magnesium, that's important, because those are the three main micronutrients that the pollinators are going to use for pollen tube growth. So if you have deficit of those, then you have to correct that before flowering. And there are different things that have been used not to increase pollination, but to increase retention of the fruits after fertilization and initial fruit set. So and those could be of interest, but for that you need first a good pollination, because if not, you cannot retain the fruits.
Pollination is fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, so gibberellin is registered on avocados in California based on work that Carol Lovett did many years ago.